On a crisp September evening in 1969, 15-year-old John Robert McCabe, a bright high school sophomore from Tewksbury, Massachusetts, left his home to attend a small local dance at the YMCA. Friendly, outgoing, and full of teenage dreams, John was the kind of kid everyone in town knew and liked. He had big plans, a warm smile, and a family that adored him. But that night, he never returned home. What should have been just another ordinary night in a quiet New England town turned into a nightmare that would haunt this community for decades. Hours later, John's body was found in a vacant lot across the city. His hands and feet were bound, his mouth taped shut, rope marks carved deeply into his neck. The scene was brutal, senseless, and terrifying. The kind of crime that shakes a town to its core. Parents whispered warnings to their children. Friends replayed the night's events in their minds, and rumors began to swirl. Streets that were once safe felt ominous. Shadows suddenly seemed darker, and the rhythm of daily life came to a trembling halt. For 40 years, this case remained a haunting mystery, a puzzle no one could solve. Investigators chased every lead they could find. Witnesses were re-interviewed. Pieces of evidence long forgotten were dusted off and examined with fresh eyes. Old photographs, letters, even casual party conversations suddenly took on new significance. Clues that once seemed insignificant became critical. Secrets buried for decades began to surface, but the truth remained just out of reach. And then, a single breakthrough conversation, a long-forgotten memory, would reopen the case and ignite a chain of events no one saw coming. What really happened to John Robert McCabe that night? The answer lies in the shadows of Tewksbury, and it's more shocking than anyone could have imagined. It was a cool September night in Tewksbury, 1969. The kind of night where the fog drifts lazily through quiet streets, and the distant hum of crickets is broken only by the occasional passing car. Families were tucked in their homes, unaware that darkness was about to carve a mark on their town that would last for decades. On this unassuming evening, 15-year-old John Robert McCabe, a bright high school sophomore with dreams of college and baseball games, stepped out of his house. He waved goodbye to his mother and promised he'd be back before the street lights flickered out. But that night, John never returned. The air, heavy with the scent of autumn leaves, carried a tension no one could explain. Somewhere across town, in a vacant lot, shrouded in shadows, something terrible awaited. It was a place that would soon become the center of whispers, fear, and relentless investigation. The calm of Tewksbury was about to shatter, and the question haunting every resident was the same. What happened to John McCabe? Decades would pass, leads would vanish, and the truth would stay just out of reach. But on that night, the first thread of a mystery began, one that would grip the community, challenge every investigator who dared to look too closely, and leave a chilling mark on the history of Massachusetts. John Robert McCabe wasn't just any teenager. At 15, he carried a curiosity that often led him to explore places most kids would avoid. A bright student, he had a knack for numbers and a love for baseball. His cleats scuffed from endless afternoons on the field. Friends described him as kind, always ready with a joke. Yet there was a seriousness in his eyes, on awareness of the world beyond Tewksbury's quiet streets. His family was close-knit. His mother, a nurse, and father, a small business owner, had raised John with strict values and a sense of community. Neighbors knew him by name. His laughter could often be heard drifting from the backyard. That evening, he carried the excitement of attending a local dance at the YMCA, oblivious to the dark turn his life was about to take. To the outside world, John's disappearance would soon become the unthinkable, a shocking breach of innocence. But behind closed doors, detectives and townspeople alike would begin to understand that this wasn't just a missing teen. It was the beginning of a story that would test every assumption about safety, trust, and evil hiding in plain sight. The YMCA dance that night was alive with laughter, music, and the shuffling of polished shoes on the wooden floor. Teens from all over Tewksbury and surrounding towns had come, buzzing with the thrill of teenage freedom. John arrived, his jacket slightly worn but neatly pressed, and immediately gravitated to his friends. No one noticed the time slipping away. No one saw the shadow that lingered beyond the glow of the gym lights. And then, as the night wound down, John made the decision to leave, unaware that each step toward home was a step into a nightmare. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet, and the ordinary safety of a walk home turned into a terrifying unknown. By the time anyone realized he hadn't returned, the first threads of panic had already begun to weave themselves into the fabric of the night. This was more than a missing boy. This was the moment the ordinary world of Tewksbury shut down the detectives who would chase the truth. For decades, were only just beginning their pursuit. As hours passed, and John failed to return home, the calm of Tewkesbury turned into unease. His parents called friends, neighbors, even the local police. But the initial searches yielded nothing. Whispers began spreading along streets, lined with brick houses and maple trees, each neighbor piecing together fragments of what might have happened. The town wrestled with disbelief. Could a boy simply vanish on a quiet September night? Some clung to hope, imagining he had gone off with friends or gotten lost. Others, more instinctive, sensed something darker. The local diner became a hub for anxious chatter. The town's clergy, teachers, and shopkeepers speculated and prayed. In homes across Tewkesbury, families turned on their porch lights late into the night, hoping to see a familiar figure walking up the street. But hope and fear intertwined, creating a tension so thick it could almost be cut with a knife. The debate raged silently in the town. Was this a tragic accident, or the start of a nightmare that no one could yet see? When John's body was discovered in a vacant lot across town, the shock was immediate and absolute. Hands and feet bound, mouth taped, and deep rope marks carved into his neck which should have been a safe. Sleepy corner of Tewkesbury had become a crime scene that would haunt the town for decades. Police cordoned off the area, their radios crackling with tension and disbelief. Detectives combed the lot for clues. Footprints pressed into damp earth, fragments of fabric snagged on broken fence posts, and faint tire marks told a story of violence and deliberate cruelty. The coroner, working with forensic teams, confirmed that John had not just been killed, he had been hunted. Each piece of evidence pointed to premeditation, leaving no room for the comforting thought that this was random misfortune. The news spread like wildfire. Friends and classmates, still processing the normal rhythms of teenage life, were confronted with images of horror and questions they couldn't answer. Investigators knew the clock was ticking. Every second counted in piecing together the final movements of a boy who had disappeared into darkness. And in that moment, the first chapter of one of Massachusetts' most haunting cold cases officially began. The investigation plunged into motion immediately, but the first leads proved frustrating. Witnesses came forward with fragmented memories. A man loitering near the YMCA, a strange car parked near the lot, fleeting glimpses of figures in the shadows. Each tip sparked hope, but ultimately fizzled under scrutiny. Detectives revisited John's school friends, searching for overlooked details. Every diary entry, every casual comment at lunch, became potential evidence. Yet nothing seemed concrete. Some leads led to dead ends. Others introduced suspects who, on closer inspection, had airtight alibis. Frustration mounted as investigators realized that decades of normalcy had concealed something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. Even as the local police struggled, the state authorities joined the effort. Teams with forensic expertise and crime scene experience brought new methods, examining every fiber, every footprint, every scrap of evidence. The town's tight-knit community watched anxiously, torn between fear and the hope that justice could still prevail. And somewhere beneath the surface, the shadow of a truth that had waited 40 years to be revealed began to stir, setting the stage for a breakthrough that no one yet expected. Years passed, and the case of John McCabe seemed frozen in time. Leads blent, cold. Witnesses aged, memories faded, and the town of Tewkesbury settled into a reluctant acceptance that answers might never come. Yet, for the detectives, frustration became fuel. They pored over old case files, revisiting witness statements and forensic photos that had collected dust in evidence lockers. Every detail, no matter how small, was dissected, analyzed, and re-examined with new eyes. Technology in the 1970s and 1980s had limitations, but by the 2000s, tools that were once science fiction DNA analysis, advanced fiber matching, digital reconstruction offered the possibility of breakthroughs. Detectives realized that years of missed connections weren't failures. They were pieces of a puzzle waiting for the right lens. Rumors continued to swirl in Tewkesbury. Some whispered about a man who had moved away. Others suspected someone close to the Maccabees. Every tip sparked renewed investigation, but the frustration was palpable. Families demanded closure. Communities waited, and detectives wrestled with a haunting question. Could decades of time erase a killer's trail, or would persistence finally reveal the truth? By 2010, forensic science had transformed. DNA testing could now extract information from evidence that had been untouched for 40 years. Detectives reopened the files with a sense of cautious optimism. Every scrap of rope, every fiber, every note from witnesses was re-examined, Computerized records allowed cross-referencing with arrests, prior offenses, and surveillance far beyond what the original investigators could have imagined. It wasn't long before a new lead emerged. A conversation at a small gathering, decades after the crime, hinted at hidden knowledge. Detectives moved quickly, tracing contacts, re-interviewing old witnesses, and following a chain of evidence that had gone unnoticed for years. With each step the case gained momentum. Pressure mounted as the detectives realized they were closing in. The town held its breath, unsure if the decades-long silence would finally break. And as new forensic results came in, the possibility of justice long overdue began to feel real. The game had changed, and the hunters were finally on the right trail. Suspects that had once seemed distant became real threats. Investigators discovered that someone had lied, covered tracks, or manipulated memories. Old friendships were questioned. People who had seemed trustworthy decades ago were now under scrutiny. Every clue hinted at a network of secrets hidden behind familiar faces. The detective team pressed harder. Interviews grew intense. Surveillance revealed inconsistencies. Each revelation brought both hope and tension. The stakes were higher than ever. The wrong move could allow the killer to escape yet again. Even as the pressure mounted, the detectives remained methodical, piecing together timelines, analyzing motives, and connecting the dots that had been scattered for years. The walls were closing in on the perpetrator, but the shadows they had navigated for decades still held dangerous surprises. Despite years of effort and modern forensic breakthroughs, investigators hit dead ends. Witnesses recanted statements, leads dissolved into uncertainty, and some crucial evidence remained inconclusive. The community, already scarred by decades of fear, felt the sting of despair. Families whispered in hushed tones, wondering if justice would ever arrive. Detectives felt the weight of failure pressing down. Every unanswered question, every unsolved thread, was a reminder of the darkness that had gone unchecked for so long. The sense of helplessness was almost tangible, feeling that even the most dedicated detectives could not shake. Yet in the midst of doubt, a faint spark lingered, the realization that, even when progress seemed impossible, the truth was never entirely out of reach. Somewhere, hidden within the chaos of decades-old secrets, lay the breakthrough that could finally bring closure. Detectives turned inward, reviewing every interview, every report, every photograph. They revisited John's friends, family, and neighbors, asking questions that had once seemed redundant. Old diaries and letters surfaced, revealing overlooked details about relationships, conflicts, and subtle hints about that night in September 1969. It was a painstaking process, the kind that tests patience and dedication. Investigators had to balance hope and skepticism, knowing that one false lead could derail the entire effort. In these moments, they grappled with the emotional toll of the case, not just on the family, but on themselves. Even as fatigue and frustration threatened to overwhelm them, detectives realized that these revisited memories contained the keys to the breakthrough. Each recollection, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, was a puzzle piece that could finally reveal the face of the person responsible for destroying a life and haunting a community. Then, more than 40 years after the tragedy, a chance conversation at a small gathering reignited the investigation. Someone spoke casually about events long buried, inadvertently revealing a detail that had eluded investigators for decades. Detectives acted immediately, tracing connections, re-interviewing individuals, and comparing statements against the evidence in storage. What had once seemed like a cold trail suddenly became a hot lead. DNA, fiber evidence, and witness corroboration converged, creating a chain of proof that investigators had been chasing for decades. This single revelation changed everything. The puzzle that had tormented Tewksbury for generations was starting to take shape, and the town braced itself for a conclusion that no one had dared hope for, a confrontation that would finally bring justice to John McCabe and shake the community to its core. The day of reckoning finally arrived. Detectives, armed with decades of evidence and the breakthrough from that fateful conversation, prepared to confront the person responsible for John McCabe's death. Every step toward the suspect was measured. Every decision weighed against the years of investigation. In a quiet suburban home, not far from Tewksbury as a town center, the suspect was apprehended. The interview room was tense, the air thick with anticipation and years of unresolved grief. Questions were asked, responses analyzed, and slowly, the truth emerged. Lies, unraveled, confessions, carefully suppressed for decades, were finally laid bare. Investigators revealed how the crime had been meticulously planned, how clues had been buried, and how decades of silence had only delayed justice. For John's family, the moment was overwhelming, a mixture of relief, sorrow, and vindication. For the detectives, it was a confirmation that persistence, patience, and dedication could overcome even the darkest of mysteries. The story that had haunted Tewkesbury for 45 years had finally reached its apex, and the town stood united, confronting the painful reality while embracing the closure that had once seemed impossible. News of the arrest spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the community. Neighbors, friends, and classmates reacted with disbelief, relief, and a lingering sense of grief. Vigils were held, statements were made, and the town's sense of safety began to slowly return. Detectives completed their final reports, connecting every piece of evidence to ensure the case was airtight. Media coverage highlighted the perseverance of the investigative team, the bravery of witnesses who came forward, and the tireless determination of a small town unwilling to forget. Families who had waited decades for answers could finally breathe. Though the wounds would not vanish overnight, the arrest brought a measure of justice. Tewkesbury, scarred yet resilient, started to heal. The long shadow of John McCabe's disappearance finally lifted, and the detective work that had spanned generations proved that truth, no matter how deeply buried, could never be silenced forever. The streets of Tewkesbury returned to a fragile calm. Autumn leaves drifted across sidewalks, echoing the quiet nights of decades past. Families walked home safely, children played without fear, and the town began to reclaim the ordinary life that had once been shattered. John McCabe's memory remained a somber reminder of the fragility of life, but also of the resilience of those determined to seek justice. The detectives, now celebrated for their unwavering commitment, continued their work, knowing that each solved case restored not just truth, but faith in the relentless pursuit of justice. And while the night air still held traces of mystery, the story of John McCabe had found its resolution. Tewkesbury, forever changed, had finally confronted the darkness and emerged stronger, proving that even the longest shadows could be illuminated by persistence, courage, and the unyielding pursuit of truth.